One of the first comments that people make when they first visit Avery County is, wow, you guys have a lot of Christmas trees here. The truth is that the harvest of the high country began many years before the Fraser fir was deemed the Cadillac of the Christmas trees.
Avery County was settled by pioneer families who developed and lived on small mountain farms. The centerpiece of each of these farms was the garden. The family garden was incredibly important, so much so that even if you lived within the city limits of the local towns, you still had a big garden. In your family garden, you grew the food that you would eat all year long. You never went to a store unless it was to buy a little sugar, coffee, salt, or maybe, just maybe, a pair of shoes. Why? Because very few people had any cash money. And if you did have any extra cash, it was usually because you had a bumper harvest on the family farm and were able to sell or barter some of the extra produce. Sometimes it was because you took the time, aside from your constant farm chores, to hike into the surrounding mountains to gather a little ginseng or Galax. And perhaps it was because you had chosen to harvest a stand of timber on your property. Whatever the crop, mountain folks were always on the lookout for something, anything, that they could harvest and turn into cash. One of the first products that mountain folks started growing and selling were apples.
When our ancestors came to this country, they were really on their own. There was no social safety net, right? So it wasn't just a dessert. It was a survival. It was like potatoes and corn, and it was a survival food. Apples can be used in so many different ways. They're eaten fresh, of course. They didn't have electricity, but they could dry them. They could store them in the ground. They literally buried them before they built cellars. Then they would, of course, juice them, make juice, then make hard cider, then make vinegar so that they could turn around and pickle the vegetables that they had extra at the end of the growing season so that their vegetables could be saved for the winter. So the apple was probably the most useful fruit, or certainly the most useful fruit.
Avery County is blessed with a great environment for growing apples. Soon after the first orchards were maturing in the county, some folks began to look for ways to make more money from their excess apples.
Some people did plant more apples than they could possibly use. In fact, a lot of people did, I think. From what I can tell, people, a typical number was for a family to have 6 trees per family member. So if you take a family back 100 years ago that had a dozen kids, you look how many apples you're talking about. I suspect that had to do somewhat with crop failures. You had good years and bad years, and and if you had extra apples, you could sell them. In the late 1800s, I understand that there were train car loads of dried apples sold locally, bartered at local general stores by common citizens of Avery County at about 3 to 4 cents a pound, and those went up to thousands of pounds up into the Northeast. This was extra cash for people who had no cash. There were people who planted far more apples than they could use, who would load up fall apples that were grown in the mountains that would be much later than the apples that could be grown off the mountain. So in October, they would load their wagons and their horses and go down to Johnson City or down to Morganton or down to Hickory and peddle those apples.
With the hundreds of apple varieties developed after the Pilgrims landed in the New World, which varieties do you think became the local Avery County favorites?
This is 3 apples that I grabbed on the way out the door this morning that are pretty important to the community. This one on the left is the rusty coat that we were talking about earlier. This in particular is the Roxbury russet, to the best of my figuring. And the Roxbury is really important because it was the first American apple. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, correct? They planted their orchards with seed from Europe. In 10 years, they had apples. It takes 10 years to get apples. Then they started using those apples and throwing the seed out or planting it. We don't know which. And then 10 years later, by 1640, we had some new trees. This apple came of that, 1640, from Roxbury, Massachusetts. It's just, everybody calls it a rusty coat, but it's a Roxbury russet. They're very dry apples, but very, very sweet. And this is the follow water that I described as a very beautiful apple with a lot of blushing color, and the word is, I forget what state it came from, but it's the middle 1800s, 1830, 1840, and it was discovered on the side of a creek where the apples would fall in the water, so it became a follow water, and the pronunciations are incredible. How many different ways you can say that. This apple has so many names, I don't know what to tell you it is. It goes by a Glory Monday if you get it in Linville, North Carolina. It goes by the name Notley P if you happen to find it down on the river, down on the Tow River. But if you're from Beech Mountain, you probably call this the Jimbo. And all are correct. There's no wrong names for apples. This apple ripens in October. This one also ripens in October. It's not as sweet, but it will keep well also. And for a lot of people in the Beech Mountain community, at least, it's used for their apple butter making.
Another crop harvested by local families was timber. Taking advantage of the region's thick virgin forests, local farmers cut or sold the trees on their property to one of the big logging companies that came into the area in the early 1900s. The logger's tree of choice was the mighty chestnut. It grew everywhere throughout the mountains until the chestnut blight wiped it out in the middle of the 20th century.
Chestnuts are worth about 3 or 4 times more than any other 3 or 4 species of timber. Chestnut. It grew big and fast, and it made good shingles, fence posts. It had a high resistance to rot, and high resistance to termites. And when I was a boy, I remember the mountains looked like skeletons. The blight come in, it's an airborne fungus, and it start killing the tree up the top, and it come all the way down. The last ones to live would be the branches down on the bottom.
Harvesting timber was not an easy occupation. In fact, logging was, and still is, very dangerous. In the old days, if a tree rolled onto you, or a falling branch hit you in the head, there was no local hospital to rush to. The nearest doctor might be miles and miles away, across some rough country, and the only way he was going to be able to get to you, or you to him, was by horseback.
And logging is the most dangerous thing we've got. I've had 5 men killed in my life logging, and one of them my brother. Son, I've taught safety classes on it, and I think the best point I get across to all of them is stay sober for damn sure. And keep your distance. I was cutting timber years ago, and I was good at it. And I've cut trees that I was scared of them. My heart was way up in here. And understood the danger of it. Nothing happens the second time. That's the reason can't learn it fast enough. But I had a tree left fall out. It broke his shoulder. Set my shoulder off down here. And I got myself to the emergency room, and they patched on me for about 3 hours. And I went back to work the next morning with one crutch. Timber cutting is very, very dangerous.
Besides growing crops in their gardens, Mountain folks were always on the lookout for plants and resources growing in the wild that they could harvest and sell. One of the most important plants that many Avery County families gathered was ginseng. It was so important that often in the fall, the whole family would leave the farm and head into the deep mountains looking for the elusive plant. And to avoid sleeping out in the elements, they often built rough shelters from which they would make day hikes, gathering ginseng as they came and went.
It is one of the persistent themes in Appalachia. I mean, ginseng was one of the first sources of money that mountain people made. Daniel Boone probably made far more money with ginseng than he did with hides and that sort of thing. When it was first discovered, which is the wrong term because the Cherokees were using it all the time, but a Jesuit in China wrote an article, really it's a letter which he sent out about the ginseng that he came across there and the healthful benefits it had. And then people like Andre Michaud, who was a botanist and knew and kept up with this kind of scientific literature, when he discovered in this area, he showed people how to cure it for the Chinese market. And so it was marketed, from Canada all the way down to Georgia to China.
Ginseng, of course, is used for a variety of medical reasons. Very popular overseas right now, and for decades or generations. That was a source of income because there are not very many sources of income. People would, subsistence farm. You grew what you needed. But to generate a little cash, you would go out in the woods and pick sang. And, local people could find it. They would bring it home. They would dry it. They would put it in bunches. They would take it to a local merchant, usually, who would buy it from them and then ship it out on the train. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of wholesalers in Avery County. You have the Wilcox family in Boone and Watauga County that were wholesalers and that type thing, so we could go and deal with them. But it provided cash for the things that you couldn't grow, like coffee or sugar. So, people would go out and would dig sang.
Aside from ginseng, another local product that Avery folks gathered in the wild was Galax. When people were going into the hills to gather it, they often said they were going Galacking.
Well, Galax grows pretty openly all through the mountains. I know places where it just is a whole carpet covering the forest floor. There's been a lot of problem with poaching. That again, this was something people did to make money. You gather it, put it in bundles, and sell it to florists, and it was a way of making, money that didn't cost you anything but time.
The national and international floral industry drove the demand for a lot of high country flora, even as far back as the early 1900s. Another wild plant that they bought from locals was called dog hobble.
My grandfather collected dog hobble. It was sprays is what it was always called in our family, but he collected it for many years and sold it to florists in Elizabethton, Johnson City, Irwin, those areas, and maybe a few in North Carolina, but he gathered those sprays. They all had to be perfect, and laid them down and stacked them, 25 to a bundle, and tied them with a string like merchants tied their things. That merchants used brown paper and string to tie a lot of things they sold in the early days. He used the same brown string. When we gathered Galax the same way. You put them 25 leaves to a bundle and tied them, and then you packed the leaves this way and this way, and so that they would not get crushed during shipment. A lot of times you sold to places like Sluter Floral and the local groups, but my mother at one time shipped directly to Pennsylvania when I was probably less than 10 years old.
Besides serving the floral market, many Avery County families picked local plants and herbs for national pharmaceutical companies. With a veritable outdoor pharmacy of medicinal plants growing wild in their backyards, these families took advantage of nature's bounty to make a little cash.
Some of the things that people harvested from this area was things like birch leaves, birch bark, what we called beadwood leaves, it's now witch hazel, elderberry bloom and elderberry leaves, blackberry roots. The one thing that my family collected before we moved into the jail and we as kids did some of these things was ragweed dust. Have no idea what it was used for, but we sold it to Wilcox Drug Company in Boone.
The tradition of picking wild plants, flowers, and shrubbery for use and profit goes back to the earliest days of the high country settlements. Famous botanists who visited the area, like Andre Michaud, John Fraser, Asa Gray, and others, visited for that very reason. They wanted to collect some of the unique local plants and take transplants back to their nurseries in Europe and the North to raise and sell for profit. One man, however, had the vision of starting a local nursery. His name? Samuel Kelsey, and the nursery he started over 100 years ago is known today as Gardens of the Blue Ridge.
But he wanted a home in the mountains, so he searched out Highlands, North Carolina. He moved to Highlands with his family and decided that he wanted to start a nursery there. So he started a nursery of shrubs, plants, and that kind of thing, and some wildflowers.
Soon, however, Mr. Kelsey decided that he didn't want to stay in Highlands, North Carolina, and decided instead to move up the Blue Ridge to Avery County.
They decided they wanted to come to Linville. And actually, we have a letter from the Ku Klux Klan, an original letter, and it says that we do not like Yankees here, with an expletive, they put that in. And it says, we know how to use a gun. And if you come interfering with us here in Highlands, we know how to use them.
Under that type of pressure, who wouldn't be tempted to move? So, Mr. Kelsey packed up his family and his nursery and moved to Linville, North Carolina.
He was staying at the Osceola Lodge at that time, and my grandfather worked there as a young boy. He was 14 at that time, and Mr. Kelsey realized that he knew what he was doing, working around the shrubbery and doing all those things, kind of things, so he asked him to come work for him at the nursery that he still called Highlands Nursery, right up here. It was on 221, right before you get to Linville. And that's where then my grandfather stayed, and eventually the older Mr. Kelsey went back to Massachusetts, and Harlan, his son, stayed there and became the manager. He began to travel some too, and he put my grandfather in charge. And eventually he moved back around the early 20s, maybe 1920, and he sold out to my grandfather, who renamed it around 1923, Gardens of the Blue Ridge. And it has remained that name to this day.
In its earliest day, Gardens of the Blue Ridge continued the local practice of gathering wildflowers and plants and selling them to suppliers all along the East Coast. They also started setting up their own cultivation beds and growing the very same flowers and plants from seed. It was hard work, but it employed many Avery County citizens.
At that time, you could gather plants, wildflowers and shrubs and things, whatever they could to gather those plants. And everybody that brought them in, where you could see they were hard-working people. There was also, not just the digging of the plants and the planting and propagating of them, but there was a lot of work in getting them shipped, getting them ready, getting them out to people, and all that kind of thing too. Pay was, I've got lots of books to show you. Like $1.80 a day, maybe, for some, and that was pretty good, maybe 45 cents a day.
Although that doesn't sound like a lot of money to us today, it was good money for the local folks in the early part of the 20th century. And as the years passed, more and more local farmers saw the nursery business as a way to make money. They too started growing native plants and shrubbery, such as mountain laurel and rhododendron, for which there was a great demand in the Northeast. In fact, so many Avery County residents got involved in this business, the county soon acquired the nickname Shrubbery Capital of the World.
Yeah, as far as this area being the shrubbery capital of the world, first off, it was the environment, the climate. and the environment and the soil structure is just so good for growing the native rhododendrons, laurels, and back in the day when they used to collect them out of the wild, the Forest Service would burn off these forests and they would go dig it, and then they started digging them and planting them in their fields. And the field conditions were just so right for many of the native shrubs because the soil around here is very acid, and that's what most of the native shrubs require. And then the cool summers and the amount of rainfall is just perfect for growing all of the rhododendrons and all of the native azaleas and such as that. So they started planting them in these open fields, and they would produce quicker than they would in the woods in a better looking plant. So, that's where a lot of that shrubbery capital of the world came from.
Avery County has a long history of its citizens harvesting nature's bounty, but for most, it was never really more than a seasonal or part-time thing, usually done in the fall, after the year's corn, bean, and potato crops were in the barn. As with apples, surplus quantities of these crops were also sold or bartered for the small luxuries of life that couldn't be grown on the family farm. Some farmers even began specializing and growing items like cabbage and potatoes, strictly for the retail market off the mountain.
Prior to that time, Avery County was big on cabbage farming, potato farming, beans, and all the vegetables that were shipped out. In the early 20s, we had our first farm agent, which was Charlie Baird, and they grew seed potatoes. Avery County was famous for the seed potatoes they grew and shipped out to other places. Today we get our seed potatoes from Maine and Canada and places. Mr. Baird lived down on what's now Old Toe River Road. He had a big cellar under his store, and he stored farmers' potatoes there till the spring when they started shipping them. In the 30s, Van Camps came here and bought bean crops, and I have an advertisement showing where they said they only wanted one kind of bean. They would not purchase any other kind. But I think it was tender crop they wanted, was the name of the bean they wanted. And cabbage was a big thing. It was all over the county. People grew 50, 60, 100 acres. My husband's family at one time probably had 100 acres, and they hauled to Hendersonville, to Winn-Dixie stores, to Boone, to Goodnight Brothers Produce, to Boone, to Dale Green Produce, and they even went as far as Raleigh with loads of cabbage and different areas, but their primary customers were in Boone and Hendersonville.
Unfortunately, however, the profitability of growing and shipping crops like cabbage and potatoes diminished as the 20th century wore on. As large corporate-style farms began in Florida and the West, mountain farmers were no longer able to compete. High shipping costs, shorter growing seasons, and a diminishing labor pool began to take its toll.
And labor became hard to get. Folks that had once worked on the farm were taking other jobs where they could make more money, number one, and where they would have year-round work.
With the profitability of traditional farm crops like beans, potatoes, and cabbage losing their luster, Avery County farmers began to look for a new crop that they could harvest. And the product they chose was one that had been growing in the county for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the Fraser fir.
Most Christmas tree farmers in the early years were already farmers. They farmed vegetables and produce. As they saw the decline in those crops, they saw people wanting to buy more and more Christmas trees and shrubbery.
But in the 50s, we started cutting Fraser fir off of the Rhone. Mount Rogers and Rhone both had good natural stands of Fraser fir, and they began to be cut and taken to the cities like Charlotte and sold retail for about $1 a foot.
My husband's family started a Christmas tree lot in Charlotte where they cut trees on the Rhone mountain. They cut the big trees down, cut the top out for Christmas trees, and sold the boughs and tips to Sluter Floral. They got $7 a tree back in the 50s, and they thought they were getting rich, and they were making good money at that time.
Wanting to maximize the money that they could make, Avery farmers quickly realized that they needed a better supply of Fraser firs to sell off the mountain. Instead of just harvesting wild trees on their own and other mountaintops, they now began to go to those same places and dig up seedlings that they could then take back and replant on their own land. By doing this, they had a much better control of quality and quantity. And as with any new crop, there was a steep learning curve. Successes and failures resulted, but eventually they learned how to grow and harvest a high-quality tree that became the best seller everywhere it was sold.
People with foresight in Avery County that I know of, I mean, there were people in all counties with this, were a group of growers from the Crossnor area, actually. They were Dellingers and Johnsons and other names I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for forgetting. And they planted Fraser fir, and they helped start the State Tree Association. Bill Aldridge was the founder of the North Carolina Nurserymen's Association. He turned around and helped people like Herman Dellinger and Sam Cartner, the agent at the time in Avery County, to start the North Carolina Christmas Tree Association. Mr. Dellinger, Herman, was the secretary. He was interested in it because, number one, he was a grower, and number two, he was also an ag teacher. As right when the Christmas tree industry, Fraser fir production, was in its infancy. And in those early years, what Herman and these other Dellingers and Johnsons were trying to do was figure out how to grow them. Selling them was not a problem. The tree sold itself. To simply have a fir to offer to the people of the Southeast was very, very easy because they hold their needles much better than spruces and pines. But to produce them was the job. NC State and the researchers there, our county agent Sam Cartner, and later Waits to Avery, worked with these growers from the Crossnor area.
When farmers in Avery County first started cultivating Fraser fir, they noticed that in the wild it's an open, airy tree. And so in order to make it more visually appealing, more dense, they discovered that they needed to do some shearing, and that would send more energy back to the interior of the tree. So when they started with a pocket knife, and they would go around and they would clip the ends off the trees, and that would send more energy to the interior of the tree. Through trial and error, what they discovered is technology improved with a shearing knife. This one's about 1.5 feet long, and you can imagine how much faster it makes shearing a Christmas tree.